Hello, Yakri here with another Dominions 5 video. We're going to be completing our series of videos on blesses today with Nature and Blood. Now before we get started, I want to mention that in the comments, and I think I'm going to get this name wrong, but hopefully it's a made-up name, so it doesn't matter, Zed Bloxagan said that luck and undying have a nifty interaction in that luck will prevent you from taking lethal damage, as in being reduced to negative hit points, but because you have undying, you don't actually die at negative hit points. Now, I tested this out, and it works really well. In particular, once you're in negative hit points, every attack you take counts as a fatal attack, right? So luck normally only works on an attack that would kill your unit, that would take it below 0 hit points. Since you're below 0 hit points already, every attack counts. Even if, say, you have regeneration as well, although that's quite expensive, and you can potentially regenerate back into positive hit points and your unit won't die, right? So it's very, very, very good with a high amount of undying, say 4 or 5 death points worth of undying. It's a really great combination. I think it works in particular really well with units that don't get hit too often anyway. There's sort of like this amplifying effect you get where for units that aren't getting hit very much, if you can just negate like the couple attacks that get through potentially, they go from being hit just a couple times and slowly dying to never getting hit the whole battle and escaping alive, right? So it can work really well in like high defense, high prot units that have low hit points, however, and in particular, it is one of just a couple things, maybe just 2 things, that you can actually do in order to protect yourself from spells, right? So if you get hit with a fireball, this can negate that as well. And it's really handy when someone's dropping like battlefield magic on you. Like if they cast Earthquake a couple times to clear out your units, you're gonna keep 75% of your units alive on average, right? And with Luck and Undying, it's probably going to be higher than that actually, because you'll have a few units fall into negative hit points and then continue to be protected from any further damage by luck. And some of them will still die anyway, but you'll get a pretty solid amount remaining alive. So considering that Undying as well provides 2 HP of effective, health, it has the downside, of course, that if your unit ends the battle in negative hit points, they will die permanently. But since it gives you really good value for health compared to any other blessing, it's a pretty good interaction there. So thanks for pointing that out. I want to try that out on some nations. It is very expensive. And it requires you to have a luck scale, right? Which a lot of nations would rather tank luck and take order. So it's going to be a good option only for a few nations that can perhaps afford dormant pretenders with a bless on them, and that can take turmoil and luck without feeling too bad about it. Maybe because they have good national summons or some such, or they have some reason why they have to take turmoil anyway, right? So, just something to keep in mind. Now, let's talk about Nature and Blood, and this should actually be pretty fast to get through compared to the other videos, actually. So, Resilient, you gain hit points, right? It's not quite as good value as Undying, paying you 1 point for HP, and you can do it in Blood as well with Strong Vitae. It's similar to Vitality, so I'm not sure how to pronounce that. Well, anyway, it's not great value for 1 point, especially when it's in these paths, right? Because there are some really good options farther down, Nature and Blood, and you may not be able to afford a bonus hit point, right? However, certain units can get additional benefit from this with Regeneration. Now, of course, Regeneration's at Nature 7, so it might still be worth going Nature 8 for that 1 extra HP point, or perhaps Blood 4 for an extra HP or 2. And that's because Regeneration regenerates a +1 HP, or 10% of your health, right? Rounding up. So if you have 31 HP, you will regenerate 4 hit points per turn, right? So if you have a unit with 20 hit points, it would behoove you to take Strong Vitae or Resilient along with your Regeneration or Reforming Flesh up here in Death in order to regenerate more hit points per turn. It's a pretty substantial benefit, especially on like mid to low HP units, because, you know, of course, increasing your regeneration from 2 to 3, for example, is a 50% increase. That makes regeneration much more powerful. So it can be well worth it. But it's basically, I don't know if I'd only take it to like fill up points I couldn't spend any better way outside of that usage. Low light vision, seeing in the dark. There needs to be some reason why seeing in the dark would be more useful in this game for this to be handy. Like, if we could expect just random night battles, maybe I would really value dark vision, but if it was random, then that could be a little bit too RNG for my taste as well. So anyway, low light vision, I probably wouldn't care about it unless you have some reason to expect that maybe you'll be causing darkness, or maybe like some of your units have low light vision, some of your sacreds don't for some reason. I don't know if there's any such nation, but maybe, and you want to cast darkness or something, right? Anyway, probably in most games this is just going to be completely useless, so not a fan. Minor and major, but if fighting in caves, this will activate. So as a fill point, it might be better than resilient, especially if you have only sacred mages, right? Yeah, because helping your mages out once in a while in a cave fight, not totally worthless. Okay, minor poison resistance, does what it says. This is a more niche resistance than the other resistances. However, there's always potential use for this. Maybe Pythium with their Hydras could find a use for having sacred units be immune to the Hydra poison, right? So, could be handy. Also, certain nations that might want to cast Foul Vapors, but aren't immune to it themselves, or aren't as immune as they'd like to be, could get use out of this, right? So, there's a couple weird uses, but mostly this is rarely going to be a priority for you. Forest survival, you know, like all the other survival, same goes, but it affects forests. Forests are maybe the most common terrain hazard, so maybe it gains a tiny bit of value, especially on player maps where players just love forests. People have made maps just like addicted to forests, I guess, so probably a little bit higher value. Even on the random map generator, I think forests are more common, which makes sense, right? You know, realistically. But yeah, so keep that in mind. Unaging, not a huge fan of this one. You'd think it's good, but the issue I have with unaging is all your sacred units granted long lives. I would love this for some of my old mages, but it doesn't, as far as I know. I suppose I could be wrong, but I tried it out and it didn't seem to help at all with mages that come into the game old aged. And with mages that don't come into the game old aged, there's only a few cases, like maybe Abyssia, for example, where your mages are going to come into the game not quite old aged, and then age up just into old age by the end of the game, or by late in the game, and you could prevent that with this, right? It's hard for that to be the case, right? So for that reason, I'm not a huge fan of it. It's just hard to get value out of. If it increased the lifespan of your mages, right, like what old aged was for your mages, this would be like humongously useful on a variety of weird nations. It wouldn't be super powerful, but it would be like a really nice utility thing on certain nations. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way, which is very disappointing for me. Poison weapons. This, let's see. Some friends of mine were theory crafting that this might be like the best bang for your buck murderous bless. The downside, like weapon bless, right? I think I can't remember why they were saying that, because it seems a little weak to me, but I feel like they had a good reasoning at the time. This was in a conversation a few weeks ago. I think it's because the poison damage can stack up, right? The really nice thing about it is it's not an incarnate bless. So you can take this on a imprisoned pretender. There's not many nations that would actually want to take one death to afford it, right? However, it is an option for some nations. And if you wanted to run a non-incarnate bless, this would be a really good weapon option, actually, versus many nations. Not in that it's really good in and of itself, but rather that it's decent bang for your buck, and it's not incarnate, and you can combine it with things like Blood Surge and what else is non-incarnate that's really good? If you really wanted to be a dick, Withering Weapons, and no one's going to survive the end of the battle, but they'll probably beat you before that. I guess you would combine it with like Reinvigoration and Defense Skill, and yeah, pretty much Reinvigoration and Defense Skill is what you'd combine it with. I don't think anything in Arcane is really useful. Maybe if Twist Fate wasn't incarnate only. Yeah. And I don't know if poison weapons makes them magic, so you might take magic weapons as well, and maybe like undying or something. Yeah. And you can do this like weird little bless where your sacreds aren't like ungodly killing machines, but other than like one death, you might have like perfect scales or something. Okay. Recuperation. Someone informed me in the comments. I probably should have double checked it. I didn't, but they said that units lose recuperation when they're old aged, right? Which is very disappointing for me because recuperation is not worth taking almost ever, in my opinion. The reason being is because it's good to have on sacred units. However, you can spend a few more points and get regeneration, which gives your units more combat capability, right? Your sacred units get more combat capability, and it reduces their odds of getting afflictions in the first place. And you go through your sacred infantry, right? Your non-thugs quickly enough that it's just not really worth it to have perfect recovery of afflictions over just not receiving as many before you die, inevitably, right? On mages, it's a little more useful, right? On mages, I can kind of see a use for it, but unfortunately, like, my desire would be to have this to protect old-aged units from dying of disease, right? But you can't use it for that, which really just kills a lot of the utility of this as perhaps a bless on a dormant or imprisoned pretender to protect your mages. But you could still get it for super combatants. Like, I have a hard time at seeing a reason to take this over regeneration. Like, I would either take regeneration or not take nature magic, period, probably. Or, you know, like maybe Barkskin. But potentially you could take it for thugs, right? Thugs and super combatants, things like Dione in Yomi, things like Nifl Jarls in, on early Niflheim. Those kind of units could potentially make use of this because they do slowly get worn down by afflictions, and it would be nice to have them not slowly lose effectiveness if you manage to play carefully with them and have them survive for a long time, especially units that get luck into useful heroic abilities and so on and so forth, racking up a lot of experience, you know, their big gold investment, yada yada. So that can be kind of nice. But overall, not super great. Berserker. So, unfortunately, oh, that's right, you can't click on these. Berserker. Unfortunately, when I tested this a bit because I thought it would be pretty good, and it seemed terrible. What I didn't know is that on the patch of Dominions 5 that I tested this on, Berserk in general was broken, and units couldn't go Berserk at all. So I thought, man, this is just like not triggering as often. Is this bless just shit, and only regular Berserk is useful? All right, so I haven't tested this recently, but it should be good in theory, right? Because, well, Berserk adds +2 to attack, +2 to, or not Berserk in general, Berserk 2, which is what this is, right? Adds +2 to attack, +2 to strength, and +2 to protection while imposing, I believe, an equal penalty on defense. It might be even a greater penalty, but it's at least -2 on defense. So, units that are going to make use of high defense skill, this is not useful on them. It's also not useful to take in conjunction with your defense improving bless, right? And the reason for that is kind of complicated, and I think I talked about it when I talked about the defense skill bless. And it's basically because you want to get your defense high enough that you just don't get hit at all. And as you approach parity with an enemy's attack skill, that's when you start to like get hit randomly, like with fair reliability. Like when they're even, it's like a 50-50 coin flip essentially. There's like a kind of a probability curve that I forget what it's exactly like, but basically you want to be like 2 or more points above the opposing skill to like reliably win skill checks, right? And for that reason, like trying to offset a defense penalty like this is mostly not worth it. You might be better off simply taking defense skill without Berserk because of how good it is to like boost your defense skill well above the enemy's attack check, right? So anyway, what this is really mostly good for is preventing your units from routing, right? They gain 99 morale when they're in Berserk. They will not rout even if their commander is killed. They will fight to the death. Now, this is really useful for kind of shock troops that just go into battle and fight and die. And especially masked sacreds, recruit off cap sacreds that you can just get a crap load of. This is really handy for them. because that's what you want them to do. You just want them to carve their way through the enemy lines no matter what and kill as many dudes as possible. It also allows you to do things like ignore awe, which is pretty handy. Ignore fear auras, also pretty handy. It depends on who you're fighting, but it gives you a serious advantage versus opponents that have those abilities. And opponents can potentially get them on like thugs through items. Items can give awe, for example. Items can give fear auras. Spells cannot give fear auras, but there are fear spells and other types of morale checks. So pretty handy for that reason. The bonus damage and protection is also pretty good for a similar reason that you don't want to take a... For a similar reason as to why you would want to stack defense really high, it's good to stack protection really high, and Berserker gives you another way to like add protection on top of your protection, right? And I believe it's a bonus to natural protection, so you got to be careful what it will stack with. I don't think it will stack with bark skin or any of the other protection buffs you can get from blesses, but I could be wrong. But it will stack with armor. Yeah, so this would be particularly good on high HP units that have high natural protection and armor, or that you could like... No, you can't give armor to them. Maybe if they were thugs that we're talking about, you could give armor to them. But so units with high natural... I don't know if there's very many units that really fit the bill for this ability, but I think it's pretty good anyway. Potentially, you might want to favor it over otherwise more powerful resiliency options like bark skin or Stygian flesh, simply because you don't want your troops to rout. You want them to charge into battle and fight to the death. Now, something to be careful of is that having this on your mages can be really bad, because maybe especially if you have like giant mages aren't going to die in a single hit, right? So if you're playing like Hinnom and you have this bless, and you know your big mage with like 50 hit points sitting at the back of the battle casting spells gets hit with like a lone arrow and goes berserk, he may suicidally charge into combat and die, which is, you know, not ideal for obvious reasons. So be careful if you do take this bless. Bark skin is really good, but be aware that it gives you a -5 fire vulnerability. This means that if you're set on fire, you will burn to death eventually. And so any units that are touched by fire damage at all will die by the end of the battle. And in general, you're really weak to fire magic. Now, this is a big problem because fire magic is really common, and spells like flaming arrows are really popular. So you probably want to offset this in some way. You don't have to. You can potentially play around the weakness or plan to counter it with spells in-game. But you could also take major fire resistance, for example, and have 5 fire protection instead of 5 fire weakness, right? So that's something to keep in mind. You may want to take fire magic to offset it. It's pretty well worth it. The nice thing about bark skin is it's not countered by magic weapons like Stygian flesh is. Like if you give your units the fire protection, it's not countered by anything, right? You just have more protection. So that's nice. It doesn't stack with other protection buffs, just like all the other protection buffs, but still, it's very good. Sets your protection to 10. Very strong ability, a bit more pricey than some other options, but very good in general. It's good for basically all the reasons that I mentioned Stygian flesh being good for, which is really that just adding 10 damage reduction, or probably realistically more between like 9 and 6 damage reduction to your troops is really good. Okay, it's super good, especially in a lot of the fights you see yourself in. Now, in some cases where you have like a giant hitting your unit for like 40 slashing damage, it's kind of pointless to add 10 more protection. But in a huge number of cases, it's very useful, and it's especially very good versus archers with that, while also being useful in melee, so you don't have to quite take like an air shield bless, right? Okay, regeneration. This reduces the chance that units will get afflictions when they take damage, and they will recover 10% of their health per turn. It's pretty much just what it says. It gives your units a huge amount of sustain in combat. This is particularly useful on units that have high HP, and units in general that will not die quickly, so they need to have like good HP, and a combination of that and protection or defense, or all three. So something like regeneration with Stygian flesh on units that have high defense gives you a great combo where perhaps they didn't have the best armor before, but now they have good armor, so they rarely take damage when they actually are hit. They don't get hit all the time, and if they are damaged, they can regenerate. Now, the reason, of course, that you stack this with other defense increasing abilities is because If you can do that, if you can stack it with other defense increasing abilities, it means that they will have more time alive to regain hit points from regeneration, right? If it takes more to kill the unit. Some nations and some sacreds can make good use of this even without any other bless, because they have a unit that is already pretty durable as is, and also it is quite cheap for some nations to take a pretender with like high nature pathing and just pump up nature magic. For example, Middle Pangaea is a great nation that has a couple options, probably like at least 3 pretenders where I could see myself taking 7 nature magic for regeneration and nothing else, and perhaps expanding with that pretender. So very good. Let's move on to blood magic. So we've basically already talked about Strong Vitae. It's the same ability as Resilient in a different magic school, so we're going to move on from that. Strength of Flesh we talked about previously when I talked about Earth Magic. If you haven't seen that video and you're just like skipping around for whatever reason, this is, I think it's, is it not as good? No, it's exactly the same. Bonus Strength is quite good, right? It adds to your weapon's base damage, which can be handy because since it's not a separate instance of damage like Flaming Weapons is, you can be going from like 16 to 18 damage on a weapon. Two-handed weapons get an additional bonus of 25%, so you might, I think it's 125% instead of 100% bonus from strength. So in some cases you'll be hitting a break point so that you'll go up 3 damage points instead of just 2. For archers in general, they'll usually advance 1 point of damage, but some units might not. Depends. I think it depends on exactly what their strength's at, because bows take like 1/4 of your strength into account, I believe. Yeah, so it's pretty good. The main thing is that if you increase the base damage of a weapon, you have a better probability that whatever your damage is that you're doing, it's higher than the enemy's protection, which means that on average you will actually deal damage to them. And if your instance of damage is less than their protection, so on average you don't do anything, it's not really as useful as pushing a single instance of damage past their protection than having like 2 instances of damage that is lower than their protection on average, right? I'd still rather have, multiple instances of damage in a lot of cases, such as fighting, low protection, high HP units, or units where you really need a critical hit to do any damage. But for the most part, this is pretty good. It's pretty good, and like all damage boosts, it's best on units that have multiple attacks. Blood Surge. Now this is like the all-star of blood blesses now. I like taking this bless on all kinds of units. I can't remember exactly how many rounds, a few rounds is in the description of this ability, but Blood Surge lasts for several rounds after your unit kills someone. So this is really good on things like Sacred Cavalry that are almost guaranteed to kill at the start of combat. Because, if your unit can't initially deal damage very well, it's not going to get good use out of this ability, right? Because this is an ability that boosts your ability to kill people. So you want a unit that can kind of get a free kill out of the gate, and then they'll become much more killy after that, right? Or they'll remain super murderous. So, for example, with cavalry, they lance charge, they get a free kill, and now they've got +3 attack, +3 strength, +1 defense, +1 reinvigoration. This is essentially super berserk, right? But it has to be renewed with more kills. But once they've gone into Blood Surge, they won't have much trouble getting more kills. So you just need that initial boost. Now, of course, with a lot of units, as long as they're not total rubbish, you can just trust to luck to give them that initial boost. And any, average Sacreds won't have too much trouble killing at least one enemy unit early on and getting this buff. So it's really nice for a lot of Sacreds because now in Dominions 5, you get 1 reinvigoration during the battle normally, and an additional +1 puts that up to +2, and it just means you can negate that much more of your encumbrance penalty. And you're doubling your base reinvigoration. That's the good way to think about it, which means that it's going to take you twice as long to fatigue out as it would have before, or, well, not exactly twice as long. That's not the way to put it. It won't actually take you twice as long. It's weird because it depends on how much encumbrance you have. Of course, if you have a very high encumbrance like 8, increasing your reinvigoration by 1 is not going to give you twice the amount of time before you pass out or whatever. But if you have an encumbrance of 2, for example, increasing your reinvigoration by 1 means you will never pass out. So it's a bit different. I feel like I need a whole... I think I explained Reinvigoration in one of my previous videos in detail, but I probably... Suffice it to say, it's very good because becoming fatigued is very bad. And any amount of additional Reinvigoration will increase the time it takes for you to become significantly fatigued during battle, and you know, even if it's good enough that it completely eliminates your ability to become fatigued normally, people can cast spells on you to make your unit become more fatigued, and this will make you essentially resistant to that, right? Because as you increase in fatigue, you take penalties to your skills that scale, and after 50% fatigue, your armor becomes half as effective. At 100, you pass out, become helpless, and can be easily slaughtered by pretty much anyone. So it's a very good bonus for elite units. And of course, we've talked about attack, skill, and strength, and defense, and why those things are good previously. So it should be fairly apparent to you now why this ability is so good for just 4 blood points, right? Okay, Blood Bond. This is a really interesting unit, and a lot of people have a hard time telling if it's good. I think the TLDR is this is quite good. Transferring half of all incoming damage to other blessed friendly units that are nearby is really super good. It combos extremely well with Regeneration, for example, because taking an attack that does 8 damage, well, now it only does 4 damage to you, and it spreads, you know, depends on how many units are within range 5, but let's see. It's probably going to spread, let's say there's 4 units within range 5, those 4 units take 1 damage each. So that's negligible damage to your companions, and the unit, if you're the unit, you take 4 damage. And let's say you have Regeneration, and you're a decent Sacred unit, so you have at least Regen 2. And so next round you regen 2 health, and so now those other units all regen 2 health as well, and they've essentially negated 6 damage out of the 8 damage you took in the course of 1 round, right? And the thing is that another unit could take a 4 damage hit as well, and it could deal 1 more damage to all these other 4 units. And so basically what would happen is that you'll get more benefit out of your Regeneration, because these other units that maybe are not being attacked, or all the attacks that round missed them and they're at full HP, they're not regenerating. Well, now they've taken 2 damage and then they regenerate it, right? So that's just damage that's just going away when you're in that scenario. And in general, Blood Bond will keep your unit combat effective for longer, right? Because the more units you have in a square, the more repel attempts you get, the more targets there are to potentially be attacked, which means that single units will be taking less attacks, usually, which means defense is more effective in essence, or in practice, defense is becomes more effective because of that. And it means that you have more units making attacks, which is reducing the amount of incoming attacks by killing people more quickly. So even without Regeneration, causing your units to slowly die together instead of one at a time in bursts is actually more effective, I believe, since it doesn't actually result in your units taking any extra damage or anything. It's just moving it around so that they die as slowly as possible. So this can be quite good. The disadvantage really being that it does open you up to some weird weaknesses. I'm not sure if any overkill damage can bleed through this ability. If not, it's probably not too bad, but in cases where a unit just gets nuked down for like double their HP and damage, so that if it gets halved and half is transferred off, they still die, that's a really nasty scenario for you, because your units are just taking like a buttload of damage spread out between them, and it's not saving this unit from death, right? Even and so in that sense, you're kind of making enemy souls more accurate. So this is probably kind of weak versus specific things in the mid to late game like Thunderstrike, but it's going to be really strong against just man-to-man melee combat, flaming arrows, all kinds of things like that. So good to bear in mind. Also, lesser evocations like Fireball will not be super great versus Blood Bond. Unholy weapons, not a fan. Absolutely not a fan of this. Only works on sacreds. It's super good, but only works on sacreds or against other sacreds. Too expensive. This is 6 blood points. Like, why don't I pay for a different buff, basically? Why don't I pay for like 2 other small buffs? Like, I don't want to say it's 100% useless. Like, if you can fight sacreds with your sacreds, this is super good. However, often sacreds are not the only thing you're going to be fighting, and then the rest of the time this is totally garbage. So I have a hard time seeing how you can make use of this. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but like really don't recommend this in at least 99 out of 100 games. If there is a case to be made for this, it's going to be a very slim edge case or some weird tactic where you know you're going to have to fight someone who's going to be using almost entirely sacreds, and that's like the fight that actually matters for you winning the game. Probably, even then, you just never use it, probably. But, hard to say for sure. Blood Vengeance. Blood Vengeance is super good. Blood Vengeance is super expensive. Blood Vengeance I find is a lot harder to consider picking up in Dominions 5 than it was in Dominions 4. So the benefit to Blood Vengeance primarily, though, is that it makes it really dangerous for enemies to cast evocations into your troops, right? Unfortunately, it would go really well with Blood Bond, but yeah, that's not an option, sadly, as Blood Bond costs 5 Blood Bless points. So, how does this is by reflecting damage upon an attacker, right? Now, attacker can mean the mage who cast a fireball spell. And so what happens is if a mage casts a Thunder Strike on your sacred unit, right? And it kills the sacred unit instantly, dealing like 40 damage. Well, that damage is going to attempt to be reflected upon the mage. The mage has to make a magic resistance check, and if they fail, they take the 40 damage. Now, they'll probably pass because they're a mage and they have high magic resistance, but if they fail, they are fucked. And if they kill a whole square of sacreds, they might have to make the check 4 times. And if they fail any one of them, they're dead. If they cast this spell twice into 2 squares of sacreds, there's a really good chance at this point that this mage is going to get wrecked. And it's even more certain for other spells like Earthquake, for example. So this is really good versus those, and it works versus all units, of course, so it is going to make your units a little bit more effective in melee combat and the like. It's going to work it works versus archers. It's good in all scenarios, but it's really to stop the evocations, and you have to remember that this means that you can kill your mages with friendly fire by shooting spells into your sacreds accidentally. So you have to be careful about what nations you consider taking this on. But essentially, you take this on nations where you don't have to worry about your own evocations too much because your units are immune to them, like Abyssia. Although, I'm not sure there's a good case for taking this on Abyssia, but for example, you wouldn't have to worry because you'd be immune to your spells as Abyssia, or as Middle Bandarlog, because they're going to be casting single target 100 precision spells, so they won't accidentally friendly fire their own units, and potentially as nations that are like Earth and Nature nations. Of course, your mages can go off the script and throw some like Blade Winds in there, which would be unfortunate, but primarily you'll use your mages for buffing, right? And especially if you're not even going to research evocation, then you don't have much to worry about, and you can just buff your units, and when the enemies try and throw spells at your units to kill your nasty buffed infantry that they can't fight in regular combat anymore, Blood Vengeance will kill their mages, and often their mages are going to be worth as much as 10 of your regular units, so even if a lot of your dudes have to die to take out one of their mages with this, that's perfectly okay by you. Especially if it's, say, a cap-only mage or something, right? Okay, so this wraps up Bless's blood. Oh, I guess I should make a general balance point, which is that I would say Blood Vengeance is okay. It's niche. You might want to take it in certain scenarios to counter those massed evocations, but it's pretty expensive now, and so I would take it fairly rarely and really be sure that you're going to need it before you pick it up. But it's not bad per se. Okay, so comment on Blesses in general, as this is the wrap-up video to this whole thing. And that is that often you want to combine blesses because the blesses together are greater than the sum of their parts. And that's because, so that's for a couple reasons, right? Certain bless abilities have kind of a multiplicative effect, right? Where if you take abilities like Stygian Flesh and you take abilities like Blood Bond that are going to make your units live longer, Regeneration becomes more valuable because for every round that your units are alive, they're recovering HP with Regeneration. And for every hit your units take without dying, and if you say boost their HP or something, Regeneration is benefiting you by reducing the odds that they'll get an affliction with that hit, right? So Regeneration just gets more and more useful the longer your units are going to be able to stay alive. And there's another kind of I don't even know how to put it, like benefit, I think I've mentioned so several times actually, to stacking stats like defense and protection really high, and that's that if you stack them high enough, most of the time your units will take no damage at all, because they'll never actually get an attack landed on them, or because attacks won't deal any damage to them. And there's like sort of a tipping point with this where you can get it to the point that there's good odds that versus certain types of enemies, your units won't take damage at all during the battle, which means they won't pick up any afflictions, and obviously you're going to win that battle, right? Unless perhaps your units are scared off by a fear aura or something, right? A kind of a similar comment can be made about offense, but I find that a lot of sacreds in the game have so much offensive capability that it's not really a problem. There are certain units, like Flagellants, for example, that have kind of crappy offense that's really easy to augment. Flagellants have a fairly weak attack with fairly low attack skill, but their weapon hits twice. And so that means that things like Blood Surge, or Strength of the Flesh, or like Flaming Weapons, or Blood Surge and Flaming Weapons are hugely useful to them, because like with Blood Surge, as soon as they get in a hit finally, their attack skill goes from crappy to great, and their damage goes from okay to enough to beat most armor and still deal significant damage. And then they get to hit twice with it, and they're a very cheap unit. So that's something to keep in mind. That a lot of sacreds aren't really going to need too much help in the damage department. And there's like sort of a break point, right? Where if you consider like how much armor units have at a certain age, being able to deal more damage than that is really useful. Being able to deal 3 times more damage than that is kind of pointless, because you're already one-shotting people at that point. You see what I mean? Like, boosting the damage of Nephil Giants is kind of fucking pointless, because they only get 1 attack, and it deals like 30 damage or something, right? So you're just gonna like one-shot humans twice over, even if they're in like heavy armor. So what's the point, right? There's not really a point in doing anything except buffing their durability, because that means they get to live longer to make more attacks, which is another reason that durability is kind of, like I was saying, multiplicatively more valuable as you stack up different types of durability, right? Because you get to live longer, which means you can either not take damage at all when the battle ends, or you can regenerate either from regeneration itself, or because you cast the spell regeneration on your units, or you gave them a regeneration item, or you cast healing spells. Not that anyone ever does that in the minions, but hey, maybe it'll happen once in a while. Or something else, like you have a life drain. You give them a life drain attack or something, right? You cast Soul Vortex. That's gonna happen on some thugs, right? So there are a variety of ways that can stack up, and it's also good to take a look at what nation. I mean, this is a little more of an advanced tip, but take a look at what nation you're playing, and take a look at what items you have access to, what spells you have access to, and consider, like, you know, am I going to be casting Barkskin on my sacreds anyway? Because if you're going to rush Alteration and start casting Mass Protection on your sacreds as soon as you can, for obvious reasons, you shouldn't take Barkskin. You also probably shouldn't take Stygian Flesh, because they're not going to stack. And in fact, you might want to take something weird like Luck, because maybe you don't have access to Astral Magic at all, and now you've got Luck on all your sacreds, and then you cast Barkskin, bringing the protection up to something quite decent. And maybe you also take a Dormant Pretender and expand with your non-sacreds, because you expect to just transition into this sacred mid-game, right? Where you're going to have that spell, and then you're going to have a bless that stacks well with it, right? Or like Flaming Weapons. You can't get Flaming Weapons on melee infantry at all, right? So that's a particularly good bless, because you can't just replicate it with a spell at some point in the game. Similar thing with Blood Surge. So just bear those things in mind, like, and what things stack as well. For example, the spell Regeneration stacks with Regeneration, but the spell Barkskin does not stack with Barkskin, it just overwrites it. So if you can cast Regeneration on your units and you've had the Regeneration Bless, hey, more power to you, you have 20% regen now, that's great. If you did something else, like spent points on bonus hit points, so your units regenerate 1 more hit point per turn, and now you've got 20%, well, that's 2 more hit points per turn you've gotten out of that hit point boost, bless boost, right? So lots of stuff adds on together like that. Well, but not everything does. And so keep in mind, like, why you're taking the bless, and what's gonna be able to grow in power as the game goes on. Things like Stygian Flesh, for example, while really good, it's really good because it's good in the early game. It's really good because it's really cheap. It's really good because there are a ton of pretenders who have like 2 or 3 death path death pathing, and they're relatively cheap, or they're like the Master Lich, and he's really good not because he's cheap, but because he can run around and engage in battles, and you're never going to lose him for more than 3 turns, right? And when you lose your pretender, when your pretender dies, you lose your bless, remember. So if you have a pretender that can easily die, you can't run around with them. So those durable pretenders have a lot of value to them. But Stygian Flesh will probably be countered by a lot of things by the time you walk into the mid-game, so you should have like maybe a sort of game plan where you're going to transition. Like maybe you have Stygian Flesh and Fire Resistance, and then by mid-game you start casting Barkskin to overwrite Stygian Flesh, and it does the same thing, but now you've already prepared a counter to its weakness, and now it's countering whatever your opponents researched or took as their own bless to counter your units, right? But you still got this really great early game benefit where you could really chew your way through non-sacred units and indies, right? Yeah, I think that pretty much covers everything. I mean, if possible, I made some mistakes and whatnot, like usual. Feel free to point them out in the comments down below. I'm always happy to learn more about the game, and it's good to make corrections when possible. Yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed, and Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, or have a great Monday, everybody.